This is all of our boot accessories that we've slowly developed over the last 4 years as we've done more and more boot reviews and realized how many things are missing in the market. So be sure to check out all these below. They make great gifts, self-gifts, and it's a huge way that you can help support the channel. So check them out below. We got sent one of the more rare World War II boots of all time because we've cut apart the World War I US boot, the M43 World War II boot, the British World War II boot, a Japanese World War II boot, which is crazy, a Soviet World War II boot, even a German World War II boot. But never France. And part of that's because of the French military story of World War I to World War II is really fascinating. It's a little known story about how a lack of innovation in footwear had a huge impact on the French troops. So we're gonna cut these historic pieces of art in half to really figure out why these failed so miserably. What do I mean by them being so finely made if they failed? Why France fell behind in innovation? And are these good regardless of today's standards? And there's one thing in this boot that's so rare that I don't think we've ever seen it in any of the boots and shoes that we've cut apart, over 500 plus pairs, $100,000 worth of stuff cut in half. We've never seen it in anything other than the most high-end dress boots in the entire world. And for some reason, it made it onto a World War II boot. And one of the coolest things and why I love cutting apart these historical military boots is the rapid development of technology that was forced through the crucible of literal life and death of World War. So much so that if you don't adapt and you don't improve, you die. It's war. And that is evident in the history of the French military boots during the 20th century. Because in 1914, during World War I, French troops were supplied with a low ankle boot made from veg tan leather with a leather sole, metal hobnails, worn with puttees or gaiters. They call them the MLE 1912. But these boots proved completely insufficient for World War I. Because if you remember, World War I was cold, it was mucky, it was trench warfare. People were in the trenches for years at a time. And that caused one of the hidden factors of the war that caused a lot of casualties, trench foot. It was one of the biggest and one of the most prevalent issues in trench warfare. And so these guys were literally just walking around in human filth, in water, in muck, rotting their flesh off their feet. Because at the time in the early 1900s, there wasn't rubber, there wasn't waterproof materials. They were basically waging war in dress boots. So because of those issues, in 1917, improvements were made to that boot to provide a little bit thicker leather and better stitching to help with waterproofing and durability issues. And they called these the MLE 1917 boots. Still an ankle boot, still had to be worn with gaiters, and that really did not improve or fix any of the problems with the trench foot and all the issues that was seen in the previous boot. They had an opportunity to improve, but they just didn't push it far enough, and so they're already falling behind as of 1917. And every nation involved in World War I suffered similar problems. Go watch the World War I US boot, and we go through a lot more of what trench foot is. We had to repost like twice because YouTube did not like the visual images of trench foot. And to me, I'm like, that is the history. That's the war. That's an important part of history. So we probably won't have too many photos of trench foot, but we'll sneak a couple in there. But every single nation struggled in World War II to make boots that could perform in trench warfare. It just wasn't, there was no such thing as a boot that was made for that kind of environment. But even after World War I, not many improvements were made on their military boots. And this is partly due to several factors, with the psychological impact of war, the never again mentality French used from suffering so many losses, political instability. There's over 40 government changes between the wars, and that political divide slowed down military innovation significantly. And one of the biggest factors was just the economic constraints caused by the Great Depression that impacted the entire world, forcing France to maintain the World War I era equipment instead of investing in modernizing and innovating to try to improve the huge issue that they saw in World War I caused by the footwear. And it wasn't until 1935 that France finally made some small improvements to the 1917 boot. So then in 1939, after Germany invades Poland, France declares war on Germany, and unfortunately those French troops were still wearing basically that World War I boot that was slightly improved, but still had all the same problems. And for 4 or 5 years, they had an opportunity to look at that issue, to improve it, to try to solve the problems that every single soldier was having with their footwear, but they didn't do it in time because in 1940, after the German Blitzkrieg rapidly destroyed France, further boot development was completely off the table, because what do you do when your country is completely overrun by And other nations' boots were at this point already significantly more modern and versatile during the war, so much so that even during the occupation of France, French soldiers opted to use captured German boots to wear anything other than the standard issue French boots. But hope was on the horizon for the French, because in 1944, after D-Day in Normandy and Operation Dragoon in southern France, when American and Allied forces landed, the Free French troops were supplied with the American M43 boots that were significantly taller, had calf height, had all the stuff that because we reviewed those. And you can see the difference in quality. Even though they're two old school traditional boots, you can tell the American boot was significantly better. So in 1945, after World War II ended, France could finally go back to the drawing board, improve their boots, make a better boot for this new modern era of war. And these new models were called the MLE 1945. right here. But looking at this boot, you would say this looks just like every other boot at the start of World War II. Meanwhile, all the other countries are once again were innovating where this type of boot was just not going to perform in any kind of way, because these were immediately put to the test in 1946 during the first Indochina War. French soldiers immediately found out that these boots were not suited for any kind of jungle warfare, because you thought trenches were hot and humid and muggy and causes trench foot. Well, a jungle is basically just one giant trench, and all the same problems that the previous boots had were the exact same that they had with this boot. Meanwhile, the US and some of the other countries were starting to already innovate and move away from this heavy leather, these nails, started moving towards canvas, lighter weight constructions, breathable constructions, different materials. And once again, many of the French troops opted for the early versions of the US jungle boot because it was so much quicker drying, they had a better grip, it was not nearly as much materials that were susceptible to water and rot and all the heft and weight of the hobnails and all the multiple layers. So you can see what I meant by the French fell behind in innovation. They were essentially designing World War I boots for World War II. They were designing World War II boots for the Indochina War. Meanwhile, everyone was one step ahead of them, and that caused severe issues. The casualty numbers from trench foot alone are staggering, and nobody ever talks about it. You don't see it in history documentaries, you don't see it talked about in history classes. It's one of the most pivotal and interesting parts of war that never gets talked about. And that's why I love dissecting and reviewing these historical footwear, because it allows us to pull and extrapolate certain things and trends and really start to shine a light on some of the lesser known issues that the individual soldiers were dealing with in all these wars. So what is this boot ultimately? Well, the brand is French military boot. It looks like it says BTB Gorin, so I think that might be the factory that produced them. The style is the model 1945, and they weigh 2 pounds 3 ounces. And these were donated by a fan of the channel, G Hump on Instagram. So shout out G Hump, thank you for sending these in. Really cool that we were able to get a pair of these in such good condition. Look at all the hobnails, they're in prime condition. And so now that we know this boot failed, what is so finely made about it? Why is this boot still intact almost 100 years later? Well, a lot of it's due to the materials they use, because the leather is really cool leather. It's 2.5 millimeters thick. At the toe, it's 2.5 to 3 millimeters thick. And if you look at the macro shot, you can see it still has plenty of the grain in there, so it's a high quality leather. And just like a lot of the other World War II boots, they flipped the smooth grain side to the inside and left the rough flesh side on the outside, or the suede side, out, because the suede side is more abrasion resistant. It allows you to put a heavy dub and wax layer on top to make these as waterproof as you can. And it also protects that structural grain by flipping it to the inside. So a really smart way of using leather. And even to this day, even some of the heaviest duty boots in the world still use a flesh out leather because of all of its properties. And I just love the stamps on the inside. I love all these little markings and stuff. Like, look at all these, I love it. And for a nearly 75-year-old leather, it still is in pretty decent condition. If you threw some conditioning in this, you could revive these boots to some degree. And that's a testament to the quality of leather that they were putting into this. But the problem with this leather isn't the quality of leather, it was the practical use of it in wet conditions. Because no matter how much dub and wax you put on top of this, you're gonna get creases, you're gonna get folds, and there's gonna be weak spots in that waterproofing. Water's gonna seep through the thread. And so it just became an issue with all these boots that it's impossible to keep water out. And that's why later, when they innovated with the Palladium French Foreign Legion boot and with the Jungle boot, they just completely gave up on the idea of keeping water out and just went with the concept of easy in, easy out. We'll put some ports in here and we'll just allow people to dump their boots out instead of trying to keep them waterproof. And even if you look on the inside, it's smartly designed, because you've got what looks like a pigskin tongue, so you get the flexibility, the malleability, but the strength of pigskin. Even in the vamp, it's lined with pigskin. That's about as good of a lining material as you can get for these heritage style boots, for durability, for longevity, because the pigskin's really abrasion resistant. It's got a really fine fiber structure. And if you look at the insole, you can see it's a full veg tan insole in a very traditionally made historical boot way, like a heritage way of doing things. But when this type of veg tan leather insole is exposed to water over and over and over, you start to build bacteria growth in there. It starts to mold. Every time they get wet and dry out, it's more of the oils are pulled out of the leather, to a point where these become so stiff and so rigid you can hardly walk in them. And once you do start walking them, all these layers will just crack and split. Even the design is terrible for keeping water out, because the tongue is gusseted all the way down to here. So if you step in anything above the 4th eyelet, your boot is completely full of water. So even though these are built similar to the highest quality, most durable boots in the entire world, made for work in the Pacific Northwest boots, they did not fit the purpose. And you compare that to other boots at the time, they're taller, they have the wraparound buckle, they've been innovated to solve some of these problems. Meanwhile, this boot still maintains the same fail points, even starting from the 1912 boot. And that's echoed all the way down to the sole construction, because look at this heel stack. This has 1 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers of leather in the heel. And the problem with that is 7 different potential fail points for water to get in there. And when water hits leather, the leather absorbs it and expands. And then when it dries out, it overly shrinks. These actually start to delaminate. And when you're walking around in a war and your heel comes off because it's rotting on your feet, you can't have 7 layers of failure points. But that's really not even the more interesting thing about this, because if you look at how the sole is constructed through the midsole, most boots have a single length midsole that runs the entirety of the boot. But this has what looks like a welt and then a half midsole for the forefoot, a full length midsole for the entirety of the foot. And there seems to be one little layer right here that is the one thing I'm like, that's the only, I've never seen this in a boot, let alone a war boot. Well, I'll show you when we get it cut in half. And you add on top of that all these hobnails that suffer from the exact same thing. Once again, the leather shrinks and it expands and these hobnails start to rust, and over time you start losing your hobnails, you start losing your traction. And all these little crevices and creases that water can sneak into, it always does sneak into, causing failure across this entire boot. Every single layer of this is a failure point. And it's not that every other boot during this time didn't have some of these problems, but this boot specifically almost seems like it has built-in fail points. And so let's cut this thing in half and try to figure out why they built it this way. Was there some intent and some goal to make it more waterproof, more durable, or is this truly just a huge lack of innovation that was somewhat passed off as innovation for the people that needed these and depended on these the most? So let's cut them in half. Good Lord, I think it's tough. All right, we got it cut in half. If you're not subscribed, consider pushing the little subscribe button. We got a lot of really big stuff planned this year, and so we're really trying to deliver on content, show you the stuff that you want to see, show you the really cool historical stories that have really built the footwear that we wear every single day. And these are, it is a literal piece of history. This is a historical artifact to some degree. And anytime we do one of these videos, people are very upset about it, but keep in mind, we've had millions and millions and millions of views on these historical boots, and it provides historical context in a way that no museum can do, no documentary can do. And so I find a lot of value in this, and so thank you guys for your support, and check out in the links all the other historical boots that we have. So now, let's see what's inside. So what is going on in here? There's like 50 different layers. So you have insole layer, you've got a full length leather layer, you've got a filler layer at the toe, a half layer in the forefoot, a half layer in the back of the boot, and then a full length midsole outsole. Why? Why would you do that? I do not understand why they would do that. Because as far as I can understand, it would be just as easy to run a full-length midsole instead of having 2 layers, because it has that same problem we just talked about. And so what possible reason would you need this many layers? Because it's just a Goodyear welt construction. You can see on the outside, this is a 270 Goodyear welt stitch, which is really common for the time. You can see how that welt ties in through the upper into the insole. You can see how that welt is tied down and sewn down to the outsole. And usually you would see a cork filling on the inside of there, not 3 or 4 different layers of leather. So then why would they build a boot like this? I literally cannot think. I talked to Taylor, I talked to everyone in the shop. We cannot come up with a single reason, a practical reason to build a boot like this, especially for war. So I think what it is I think it literally just comes down to a lack of innovation by the French military. And part of that's because it was a war-torn country. They were getting invaded time and time again. And in a war-torn country, it's hard to innovate. And so this might have just been the best thing they could do for the time, because it is really well built. You've got that pigskin lining, you've got even brass brass nails tacking everything together. You've got a Goodyear welt construction. You've got a leather heel stack. You got all this stuff that looks like it's a high quality boot, but then on the inside, you see all the weird, janky overlapping, the mismatching materials, and just the poor design. So then what is that one thing that you never see on hardly any boots, let alone a 75-year-old military boot? It's this hidden stitch by the Goodyear welt. Because I wasn't 100% sure that it was a Goodyear welt before we started cutting it in half, because you can see the stitching on the outside, but it doesn't come all the way to the bottom, and it didn't seem like it was possible to sew down to the midsole because the midsole's feathered and there's not a continuous midsole. And so I wasn't sure if it was actually Goodyear welt until I realized that this boot has a hidden stitch. And you almost only see this in the most high-end dress boots or some really high-end cowboy boots where they have to literally peel back a little layer of that outsole, then sew on that Goodyear welt stitch, and then peel back that little flange that they created and then glue it down. So why would they do something like that? Well, this is something that might actually have some functional intended use for a military boot, because like we talked about the entire video, these boots are super susceptible to rotting in the water, and that same thing affects all the thread in this boot, because back then it was basically exclusively cotton thread, and cotton, when it's exposed to water, will rot. It'll completely disintegrate over time. And so they had that same problem with all the boots from this era in the upper stitching, but especially in the Goodyear welt stitch that's submerged in water almost exclusively. And so this might have been an attempt to solve that one problem by hiding some of that stitching that's exposed to water. But it's like they did the one thing that didn't really need to be done at the expense of actually improving this boot. For the most part, all the other flaws and all these multiple layers, the lack of innovation, being behind the times, being essentially a World War I boot built for after World War II, this boot just did not fare well. It was just a poorly designed boot for the intended purpose. And that's why these boots failed so miserably. So what do I mean by them being so finely made? Well, if you made this boot today, maybe get rid of some of this weird overlapping stuff. How much would this boot cost? It'd probably be like a $600-700 boot. And even for the time, this was a really well-made boot, but not for war, not for standing in trenches, not for climbing over bunkers and going through swampy marshes, and I don't know what all the terrain looks like. But it's just not the way that a boot needed to be made for that specific era in time, and especially in military time. But ultimately, it's war. And if you're not innovating and if you're not pushing the limits, and it costed the French soldiers themselves, the actual soldiers with literal boots on the ground were suffering because of the French military's lack of innovation. And because of this huge failure, this really pushed France to innovate into more of that palladium jungle boot kind of world. And so maybe after this, we'll find a historical palladium boot to see, did France finally get their shit together and make a decent war boot, or do they continue to fail over and over and over due to their lack of innovation? So thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think, and if you want more military boot videos, I'll put a bunch of them below, and let me know what other military boots you want us to cut apart. And thank you guys again for watching. Give us that sub, give us that like, because I really like when these videos perform well, because it is cementing a part of history and immortalizing it to some degree on YouTube, as all of these old historical boots slowly just rot away, slowly get worn and destroyed. It's fun to be able to tell these stories and save these boots in a digital form. So thank you guys. See ya. Still to this day, some of the highest duty, please, let me be free. Sorry, France.